Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Be Well reading series. My name is Nicole Tallman, and I am your host for this evening. And we have the honor of being joined by two magnificent poets tonight, both from Alice James books. We have Alessandra Lynch and we have Matthew Nienow. And Joseph Asano unfortunately cannot join us tonight, but hopefully we'll be able to book Joseph again in the future. He's an amazing poet too. So we're starting off the new year here with a celebration of poetry. It's my second year doing this for Be Well, and I'm pretty excited to do that, to share space with some amazing poets, both our readers and in the audience as well. So I'll just go ahead and get started with our first poet for this evening, who's Alessandra Lynch. And Alessandra's most recent collection of poetry, Pretty Tripwire, was a semifinalist for the Julie Suk Award, and prior collections have been finalists for the LA Times Book Award, the Balkanist Prize, and named as a top 20 poetry book by the New York Times. The author of three other poetry collections, Alessandra's work has also appeared in the American Poetry Review, the New England Review, the Kenyon Review, Plowshares, and other journals. She also has been the recipient of a Barbara Deming Award and a Creative Renewal Fellowship Award from the Arts Council of Indianapolis. Please join me in giving Alessandra a warm welcome.
Thank you for your warm welcomes, because I am in an insulated shed. It is insulated with sheep's wool. Nonetheless, it's still kind of chilly. So I appreciate you being here and being here for poetry and for listening. And thank you so much, Nicole, and Be Well series. And I'm excited to hear Matthew and his new collection as well. So I'll be reading exclusively from Wish Avenue, which just was released in October from Alice James Books. And this was a very different kind of book for me. I guess every book I write is a little bit different, of course, but I wrote the bulk of these poems during the early part of the pandemic. And this collection kind of started when I was writing, and a voice kind of posed the question on the page, what is at stake for us? And then another voice answered, I don't know. Should we travel back? And then I got really excited because I was kind of following and tracking these voices, having these conversations. And that was for at least a couple of years I was doing that. In addition to the two voices in the book, there's also a speaker who is like the first, the kind of the speaker of the poem, the eye of the poem. And sometimes she has her own poem, and sometimes she talks to the speakers, sometimes the voices, sometimes the voices just talk to each other, et cetera, et cetera. So many of the titles have subtitles which indicate whether it's the voices or the speaker. Some of them don't, because they don't need them. So the first poem I will read is called The Voices Come Out of the Woodwork for Solace. So that's the two voices together. The voices come out of the woodwork for solace. We're the underswell, soft as whale shadow, but with more movement. We're swelling and welling beneath her. We're lifting her up. Don't you feel larger, daughter? Can you feel your stomach? We live inside the floating night. Our experience is dreams when not nightmares. We break and cohere. Ours is a perfect union because we can have conversation. We fracture, we kiss, we lap around each other. We can drift a little while in vast, uninterruptible quiet, green and lavender. But we always turn and return. No blacking out in corners. No hurtling into ditches. We are the counterparts. We reflect, we sing her encounters. We murmur about her like concerned parents in the low lit fields of living rooms. We murmur in watery candlelight. The light murmurs too. Aren't we, after all, her true parentage? Isn't this why she sought us, though we've been here the whole time? This might not comfort her. This might just carry her. Buoy, hoist, and underswell. We are the more internal, soft rocking waves, here when she begins to tip over. We marry stormy water, marry the wind, the atmosphere, the icy current. We marry her to the world. Welcome. The speaker runs through shadows. Charcoal gray, the shadows, sometimes the blue of gathered dust. I run through a blur of them, soundlessly they'd fallen, around the others, branch shadows, telephone wire shadows, sleety shadows, church shadow, and the shadows of incorrigible fences, where nothing was to be kept in or out. Indistinguishable, some shadows one from the next, others well-formed and painful to watch, torn up shadow mouths of fish, the battered head of a shadow dog, the softness of crises past. They were not ominous. I ran through them so heavily I made a world of shadow. If I could will myself to fall as beautifully. There's the tiny shadow of that flower, foxglove, shadow shelf for rain, shadowy grass spikes on pale pave, shadows flattened on the roads we speed down, deposed from our meadow and its numerous inscrutable shadows, separate in our sexless shadow cars, yielding, stopping, going, as instructed by commodified light. What of the laughter of shadows? What of the respiratory shadows of leaves blown by wind? The counterpoint of your shadow with the child's, merging, breaking apart, merging again. What of loneliness? Great signifier, shadow of breath. I love those little claps that I can't hear. They're beautiful. Crown Hill Cemetery. The voices in chorus and the speaker. Were we with you in Crown Hill Cemetery? Yes, a fair way away, 2 tombstones facing each other, marked Barnett and Love. And frozen near those stones, 2 deer in the grass, a spotted doe, a stag, perfectly sylvan, unwavering. It was the first day you had ever eaten in a cemetery. A friend loses her father, he loses his brother, nothing in order, losing our mothers, all of us, their senses, our senses lost. And there you were eating. I don't know what I want with ghosts. The dead always closer than it seems. And we distant as that rushing blue fountain that rises, falls back, ashamed of its ardor. Remember walking away from the infant's grave on the steepest crest in Crown Hill Cemetery? From the infant's grace, he'd never had a voice. But there arose 2 enormous hands, 2 enormous marble hands, their fingertips touching. 7 starlings could rest on each finger, and the shadow those giant hands made. 2 giant birds, 2 deer in the grass, a spotted doe, a stag. Silence is its own voice. We can hear the spirit infant now in every room, in astronomical, star-wet fields. He's grown into a child with serious eyes, wearing a navy blue coat that he buttons slowly with care, like a very old man. Thousands of miles away, his quiet carries. He's the death within us, breathing, rustling about, ancient and unborn. The spotted doe, the stag, their quiet carriage, unbearable music. Ire, the speaker sotto voce. It's got to be somewhere, your anger, and like the moon, though very far away, still leaves an impression, is apt to hover. By the bedroom window, a child stares through from disheveled blankets, all throat, no voice. You know how violent that anger can get. A whitened rat wide as a slap, a chickadee brambled in the barb, the cheek gashed from the brass bull slung at a wine glass. Somewhere you must have a moon and anger gang, too loud to hear, too close to feel. Those hoodlums stuffing a stealth of leather into a scream. Some things shine only when they're in opposition. That anger, quiet as the near dead as the moon, quiet as a thistle seething beneath the lake, quiet tasting like a bullet, the metallics of pure air, nothing pure about your atmosphere. Quiet shelf, book quiet, readers talking about the death of quiet. You know, doctors talking in hushed tones about what happens to anger when its quiet goes. Right back at you. Okay. Um, was that a dream you had? Two voices. Actually, was that a dream we had? Excuse me. Was that a dream we had? Two voices. Was that a dream we had? Now we're floating over a field in a fish and wildlife area, floating over marsh fields where sandhill cranes poke around for crayfish and snails, then rest their slender necks. Indefatigable reflections glimmering. When you say indefatigable, I think of Plath. Are they in crisis? As we. The human voice, the art of conversation in crisis, yes, and the sandhill cranes rising en masse over ice tufts gleaming. How wide an eye does it take to perceive bird feet, a human body, the burning forest, polar bears all as one, trillium, allium, the sea, flagellum, snow as the ghosts of stars, stars the ghosts of knowing. What are we doing here? We're here to track the spirit of the speaker. Impossible without more world flooding in as she rests herself awake. It might take all the music of the spheres to awaken humans to themselves, to the earth. A poignancy in her efforts to rouse herself. Thank you. Two more, you think? Sound good? Okay. The speaker tells a story, the voices ask a question. Was barreling down the road in a 77 Silver Hornet station wagon, almost comical, could fit a passel of children and animals. Under what sky? Was it glitter-picked? How many windows? Many windows, daylight cut through, my throat tightened, no blood, several snowbirds flew overhead. Where were you going? You mean toward which personal loss was I heading? I turned and turned the key, sputtered and shook and stopped, turned the key, the sky, a cloudless ache. Have you ever seen a blue ache crossed through by snowbirds? No blood. When the car finally started, where were you going? Barreling down the road in a 77 Hornet, almost comical, heading toward the hospital, flying through stop signs, flying through squirrels, angular weeds shuddering. I banged past And 9 miles to go, white Buick ahead, the driver driving the limits down the road. I was barreling till he slowed below the limits. I honked, I flashed my lights, I yelled out the window, honked, flashed, yelled, move on, move on. The birds fled, the driver slowed near to a halt. He didn't move to the shoulder. He gave me the finger before turning left. He was not thinking about private loss. The sky ached, bright weeds angled up, sideways, frozen silver, the 77 Hornet barreling, weaving and honking in his rearview mirror on a road that was otherwise quite empty. Almost drained the road was. The birds didn't return. When do we think about private loss? The private loss of other drivers on the road? When do we think about our own? I wasn't thinking. The driver wasn't budging. He wasn't thinking. Did you ever make it to the hospital? He wasn't lying down on the bed. He was sitting up, his eyes closed, face beautifully painless, his skin opaque. I got to the hospital late. I paused for a fatal minute at the gleaming doors.
This one deserves loud claps. My God, it's brilliant. You got me choked up in tears and goosebumps and everything. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I can't see you, but I'm waving and sending my love. And I'll end with this. The lamp is like a capsized ship. Two voices muse over the speaker. The lamp is like a capsized ship, or like a lantern gone drunk, and she's to sleep by it, or stare wide-eyed at its light askew, and she's to read to it, to put it to sleep, and she's to dream in it, warmly aglow as a leopard, whose body is shadow and light, whose body isn't. She's missing again. Where did she go? Curled in. Is she spiraling? Less energy than that. Will the bed sheets accommodate her? She's alone in them, alone where she can easily breathe. Despite the horrors, the stretchers, the gasping, how can anyone breathe easily? She must be still as a Bradford pear in uneasy shadow. That tree that self-destructs, that tree that neuters the real pear trees. What a blow it was, so beautiful and erect at first. And she so lonely, lonely as a cup. Here is a card. She needs the lion today, the one who leaves gold footprints in the marsh. Thank you all for being such wonderful listeners.
Thank you so much for those beautiful poems, Alessandra. And I dropped a link to Alessandra's latest book in the chat, and I'm going to do the same for Matthew. So if you have the means to purchase a copy and support our wonderful poets, that would be amazing. And if you don't, maybe order a copy for your local library. That's cool too. So thank you so much. And thank you. We have some additional audience members since we first started. So thank you for joining us tonight. Our final reader is Matthew Nienow, and Matthew's debut collection, House of Water, was published by Alice James Books in 2016. A former Ruth Lilly Poetry Fellow, he has also received fellowships and support from the National Endowment for the Arts, the Bread Loaf Writers Conference, the Elizabeth George Foundation, Artist Trust, and for Culture. He lives in Port St. Port Townsend, Washington, with his wife and two sons, where he is pursuing a degree in mental health counseling. And Matthew, your book, if nothing is out sometime in January, tell us exactly when. I know
Yeah,
it's coming. Gotta
I
hurry up.
have a copy. I have some copies which are great. The book is actually officially releasing on January 21st, but I know there are some copies already in the wild in bookstores and arriving at people's houses. So it's that sometime in the next couple weeks. Um, but yeah, I'm really grateful to have the chance to read from the book tonight. It's been, like most books, many years in the making. Um, this book is really a book of shame. It is a book about the struggles with addiction, of getting sober, and then really trying to face honestly the impacts of addiction and other, things that come with that on the people, um, you know, around me personally, around my family, around others, uh, and there's one thing I'd like to say, up front is that I think a lot of times we get this arc suggested that when something, something bad happens, we're looking for redemption or atonement. And I think in this book, I'm much more interested in transformation and accountability. And um, yeah, I'm going to go ahead and read a handful of poems. I'll start right at the very beginning. This first poem is called On the Condition of Being Born. As you were then, as you were at the moment of your first breath outside the mother, good before you knew any other way to be. Who can remember such a time? I rely on photographs to ply memory. The first son cut out of my wife, the second pushed straight into my hands in the back room of our small rented house, both bearing the same unowned goodness, bright as a noon sun in summer. It hurt to look straight at it and stayed in the eye like a wound the brain was trying to understand or undo. Maybe it lasted an hour, maybe 3 days or 3 weeks. I don't know that it is the same in every case, but what if being human didn't mean we had to fuck this up? I've been wanting to ask questions there are no answers to, the kind that might elicit only a in response, or a hymn in some cases, as though song could shed light upon such inquiry. Maybe if it was a wordless hymn, the melody could reach back into what held us before we were broken into different lines. Source, as in the mother's mother. Doesn't it feel good to lie on the earth? I mean, actually lie down in your day clothes, face against some grass, to just lie there and for a moment stop pretending you are separate from it, to stop pretending you didn't come from it and won't go back. Eyes open or closed, thinking or not, the negative charge of the very ground taking up all the excess voltage you didn't even know you had. And there's this thing I just want to show in the book. You won't be able to see it super well, but there's a picture of me holding up one of my boys. This was like 14 years ago. Now he's as tall as me. But there's this picture, it's like uh, North Beach. It's facing the Strait of Juan de Fuca out behind where we live. And the book designer did this really beautiful thing where each section break is that same background, and it begins with the figure of me and my son removed, and slowly we fade into full picture towards the end of the book. And I just like to share that when you can't see it in person, it's become a part of how I think of the book at this point, even though it came at the very end. This next one is called Every Gift Carries a Cost. It is difficult to go back into the burning, into the bitter bowl. The knife my grandfather gave me, carving char and resin, its plastic scales meant to approximate bone. My grandfather, now only ash and shards of bone in a bag in a brown cardstock cylinder no bigger than my fist, bound with twine. I can't look at him as I use his knife, as I smudge the silver glint against the heated glass, aching for a chemical dose of what I think must, at the cellular level, approximate the bodily feeling of love. And here's another one that's kind of, the book moves through different phases, but some in that blurred landscape of active addiction. And then there's places kind of in between and looking back. So this is another one from that kind of active addiction. It's called What Luck. I lived again, wrecked, hungover, swerved in the dark from river back to bunk and never hit a tree. Never was pulled over when my only tongue was swamp. Locked my keys in the trunk in a thunderstorm, done hotboxing the Cimarron with can't remember. Car halfway in the road. Aura of blunt, pungent as roadkill skunk. Always made it home. Always stumbling thick-tongued, lucky if I didn't get the spins, mumbling if I had to speak, numb thing dumb in the truest sense. Floor was floor, and I was on it, gone wind in a way, also stone, somehow sang even undone, almost alone, even throned among future tombs I lived, the coal of my heart on a slow burn, no time to lose, no such thing as time. Eyes tuned to the lack of light, skull locked tight, crowned alive, the king of lost keys. Still finding my way into the book. Where are these poems? What page? Let's see. Um, this one's called Early Onset. Your deeds should follow your word. Addiction is a full-time job. I am housebroken and have broken the horse. I am Morse code on opposite day. The hole I punched in the wall is how I feel. I am a place for mice to enter. The mold on the bathroom sill is my middle name. Under a microscope, I am iridescent. I am a we, and our story is soon to be a major motion picture. The new world is all screen, cracked or no, grease smear or gleam. From chaos, the mind makes order. A narrative. A self narrates. I was the bad one in the bunch. I almost rotted the rest with my needs. Little red stars dot the white walls where I slapped mosquitoes while reading each night in bed. And I'm going to read a poem that I'm nervous to read. It is a poem that, there are a lot of poems. This book was incredibly difficult to write. It's still difficult to be with. And yet, for me, that is something that I'm deeply committed to sharing. I think I'm really, really believe that we need to have more honest conversations, not only about addiction, but about masculinity, about family, about the impacts that come, from a lot of things that we do, uh, even if we didn't mean to. And so there are poems of regret in this. And this is a poem that I'm like, I haven't read it in person ever. And I want to, this is the first time I'm doing that. So I'm just leaning in here. It's called It Could Have Been Otherwise. And it reads right into the first line. So I'm going to say the title again. It could have been otherwise is a truly useless thing to say, unless you are once again standing in the same moment about to say yes to the woman who has come to you in a gauze of hesitation, but who arrived without any underwear below her skirt, her decision already made, at least regarding fucking in the grass, to the metronome of desire, a faint ticking above the buzz of summer, wearing the face she learned watching movies, the way most of us learned what fucking could be like, but most often is not. Sometimes we get it right, if only for a brief interval, and find ourselves in the dream we have seen on some screen somewhere in the unmarked past, the pages of our own history neatly edited, carefully curated to keep intact a story of exactly who we are and how we came to be. For too much of my life, I turned away as the brightest moments reached their peak, so as to be in the ache of the ripe skin, the body ready to burst with sweetness. I must have been afraid. I was afraid of the silent downturn after any climax, and tried to build a house of memory from the neatly perfect and always impermanent scenes. A new favorite song tugged, a new favorite song on repeat, tugging at the want in me to be for a moment enough to risk everything for. I tried to build a whole life of such ephemera, and each time failed. Yes, it could have been otherwise. And yet I wear this face as though I have no idea how much it hurts you. Thank you. I know I love the silent claps too. This poem is called History. There is no way I can explain the past in a manner that doesn't somehow free the sparrow from the barn, but not before it crashes against the glass over and over, falling to the bench. Stunned and on its back, I scooped the sparrow from the wood and carried it outside while it slowly turned its head and nipped my fingers with its beak, a dun ghost weightless in my hands. I gave the bird to the crook of a willow, then stood back. Even that day, I had been thinking of killing myself. When the bird finally flew, I was offered no thanks, no revelation. Saving that small life from the trap of a building did not change me, at least not then, when I could see no other way to be, when it would have been impossible for me to imagine ever being the bird. Let's see. I'll do maybe like three more. I have a couple that are shorter. Um, yeah, I don't know what to call this kind of like this as the book kind of moves into things later in, I mean, I wrote these poems that arrive later in the book, later in life too, after getting sober, after looking back, after writing a lot of these other poems. Um, and so they start to take on a slightly different flavor for me. Um, but it's closer to where I am now. It's interesting. Some of the other parts of my life are quite a bit behind me. This one's called Seams of Starlight and Flecks of Gold. There is a realm within the body where the soul resides, a speck of starlight. The soul is borrowed and does not thrive without a bit of pain to work against. But only a fool seeks out suffering. It will find you, cracking the glass, sowing doubt in every field. It will find you, and you may choose to let it in. If you can live with loss, the soul grows bright. Like the sun, it touches everything. And this poem is called Someday If I Am Lucky. I will be survived by this open acre ringed by cedars and firs, this meadow collecting yellow light, where today, alive, I linger in the listening, housed in a shape capable of such ordinary song. I wish to thank the minerals in my bones and all this borrowed epiphany, all this endless ache linking arms with sorrow. May many tomorrows nest in such green valleys. May we all accept the ground we will become. And I think I'm just gonna read one more. This is the poem that closes the book. Uh, it's called And Then. And then I took off my shame like a dress made of light, like a dress made of the self-spun cocoon. I was not beautiful. It was not about beauty. Beneath my shame, the body was a raw red thing, untrained in acceptance. But the air was delicate and cool as a mother blowing gently on a burn. I had lived so long in the fabric, I thought it my skin. I had forgotten how new anyone forgiven can become. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Matthew, and thank you especially for reading poems that you aren't necessarily comfortable reading. That's always a joy and a privilege to hear. Content like that. We're at the Q&A portion now of our evening together, or afternoon, or whatever time zone you're in. So thank you so much for staying with us this long. And if you have any questions for our two featured readers, you could either drop them in the chat, or, if you're shy, or raise your hand. Either way is fine. Does anyone have anything they'd like to ask Alessandra or Matthew? No? Okay, well, if you don't, I do. Did someone unmute? Maybe they did. I don't know. If somebody was trying to talk, go ahead and talk.
All right, thanks. So I'm gonna showing my face today, not at my best, but I'm gonna turn that camera. I think there's something like raw about showing yourself. Like if there were a fire right now in my house, I would have to live as I'm in right now. So why not? See, so this is how I would look like if there were a fire right now. Matthew, I don't want to say openly that personally, like have experiencing being partner of codependent people and having parents and listening to your poetry talk so raw and deep about what it feels like for the person that's actively going through it and the people that are surrounded by them, and making something beautiful out of it. Like it got my hands sweating and just in total awe of your courage and your brilliance to put in a simple way very profound thoughts and feelings. So thank you for sharing them.
Thank you. Yeah, I really appreciate that. And I guess, I know that there are many different versions of what this can look like for people. And I think there are some pieces that may be, universal. And it is, in my family, people didn't talk about this kind of stuff. And so it's just something that I think that, we all need to face in some way. And it isn't to brush it under the rug or, like I said earlier, just try to seek forgiveness and maybe not change. But what does it look like to actually face it, to actually talk about the stuff that we want to hide? And so the writing the poems has been part of my journey to healing and to being whole. And I really appreciate you giving me that feedback as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Sophia. I'm going to ask a craft question because I always like to ask this question. I'm always curious about how poets go about putting a collection together. I know there are so many different ways that one can do this, and there are a lot of books that are written about putting a book of poems together. And I think a lot of times, I've put 3 poetry books together myself, and I kind of approach each one differently. And so I'm curious, I'll start with Alessandra. How did you approach putting your latest book together? You're muted, my friend.
Okay, I got it. So I had a whole slew of these, and I have to say that especially during those years of being pretty isolated I always knew that the voices were going to be there. So I showed up for them, they showed up for me, and just so I had like a slew. I had like so many more than could you would want to read, you know. And so it was a little bit, tricky, but reading them aloud and kind of tracking, oh, what are recurrent issues they're talking about, and also not only recurrent issues. And there's one of their focuses is the speaker herself and her state of being, as well as the state of being of the world, as well as the state of being of the trees or whatever they're talking about. So it was more putting the pulse on each poem to see, is this really fully alive? Or, are there too many straggling lines here? And what feels most urgent too? And also, I didn't want the whole book just to be the conversations, because even though I was enthralled by them, I was pretty sure like even I would get tired of reading a whole book of that kind of thing. So I liked to interweave some of just the voices speaking, some of the voice and the speaker, and then a whole bunch of just the speaker singing her own little songs. I also have one poem in there which doesn't have voices. It's called Grebe, and it is a more direct address of pandemic time. And that fit too, though, because there were the shadows of that time in our lives and the loss of that time in our lives. And as I was reading tonight, I was realizing how many children were, or child figures were in the poems I selected for tonight for some reason. And that is a huge component. But back to your original question, so it's more like the way I work generally is like, whoomph, like right now, I'm wading through all these writings I did in Virginia. And I was just like, at first I was like, I think I wrote another book. But then it's like, oh my God, because you feel so intimidated by having all that. It's wonderful to have a whole bunch of stuff, but it's also, how do you do the carving? How do you do the selecting? And number one thing is just time. Because sometimes we're really in love with things that are just not very good, and so time and perspective, and that helps a lot. But also, I like, the dynamics that come in a manuscript. You don't want to have like 3 super long poems in a row. You want to like mix it up. You don't want all of them to be totally somber. You need, a little bit of light here and there, short, long, all the tonal stuff. So it is very much like making music, I think. And I think I love, Matthew, your poems too. They're so musical, and it's such a huge part of what makes meaning in a poem for me. So I try to listen to the call and listen to that, what is happening rhythmically from poem to poem as well. Yeah. Was that a good enough answer?
That was a marvelous answer.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Appreciate
That was
that.
even more than I could ask for. Thank
I
you,
know,
Alex.
Gab Fest. Okay.
Oh, no, I loved that answer. How
Yeah.
about you, Matthew?
Yeah, I also just want to say I noticed that in your reading, Alessandra, of the music in your poems, and one of the things I loved in that the multiple voices is just like the music kind of enhanced the sense of kind of mystery. There were poems with like the shadows and the ghostliness, and um, I don't know, like I can imagine a book like that where maybe it's not like softer, but there's mystery built into the fabric of it that, creating the shape of that book, maybe even more intuitive. Um, and yeah, my putting together my first book and my second book were two very different experiences, and I've, done chapbooks and all these other things. But I this last book, like it just took years. It took years of doing, the writing in that same way that Alessandra mentioned. And so there was a lot that didn't make it into the book because it wasn't strong enough or it was too much of the same thing or whatever. And so I just got really brutal with myself in terms of like what really did seem worth keeping. And then I very slowly started putting it together. And I was really full of doubt. So it was kind of like this sense of like, I don't know if anyone's going to want to read this or if anything's going to happen with it. And then the book was under contract for like 2.5 years. And in that time, I spent a lot of time with the poems, not really like even changing them too much, but so much time and then rearranging just a little bit. And somehow, I mean, I think there's this like listening to what's happening emotionally and maybe literally in some of the poems. I wasn't interested in writing something that was just linear, so there's a little bit of like, there's echoes, just like life and memory, they keep reappearing. So that feeling of like what happened in the past can still feel very much alive. And so for me, that was a part of pacing out some of that in the book. Um, and then kind of feeling like, is this too much in something? So here's a section, but it's not so much of like this section is totally different than another section. It just needs like a little bit of like breath, you know? So I I I think it really depends on the topic, but I tend to do that, you know, something similar to Alessandra, listening to my ear, listening to my instinct, and taking enough time to do that because I can convince myself of something that probably isn't great. And so later when I can kind of get out of my own way, trusting my instinct around something seems to be the best way of shaping a collection.
Thank you for that. Well, I see we have a question in the chat, so I think we'll take this as our last one. Thank you, JD. JD wants to know of both readers. Do you have any trouble giving yourself permission to take on other voices? For example, the lover, the person in the other car, etc. You want to start, Alessandra?
Sure. Do I have any trouble taking on other voices? It's not like the way I write is, you know, back to that word intuitive. It's not about me making a decision of taking on a voice. It's not about me making a decision to write in a certain way. It's more a whole body thing that comes, you know, whole body spirit thing that comes from a lot of just writing until I'm in a usually until, or sometimes I come to the, I use a typewriter a lot. Sometimes I come to the space already in that mode. I think, C.D. Wright used the expression poetic light, and there is a change in atmosphere, and you know it when you listen to a piece of music or when you hear anyone read their poetry, the world, the air changes, right? So also it happens internally. So for me, those voices, I didn't sit down and say, oh, I want to, you know, get some voices going here. They just, it was that voice, and another voice just responded as, you know, and that's just how it was. It's sort of like me following the call of language. I've always done that, and I've been writing forever since I was like 5, 6. So always writing poems. So I am, you know, fortunate, very fortunate in that, because I teach at the graduate and undergraduate levels, and some of those my students have not written poetry till later on in life, and unfortunately they're too smart, you know, so their intelligence gets in the way of accessing the depths and accessing whatever happens more intuitively. And it even gets in the way sometimes of music, which is, you know, how to get yourself out of that. How do you, you know, stop thinking so much and just kind of like allow language to lead you where it will. And, you know, and it will lead you to where you need to go. I am just like such a firm believer in that. If you allow yourself to follow those phrases and those images, you are going to get to the depths. You don't have to say, I'm going to do a project now. To me, that's like the last place to start. You have that, I'm in the project, that's all the way up here, and the rest of your body's lost, you know? So I think sometimes it's scary to write about. I know, Matthew, I've been there too, you know, writing really, that stuff can just kind of surface unbidden. We don't want to write about that stuff necessarily, but when it needs to urgently come out of us, and you have to write that stuff, because it's sort of like clearing the space in your throat and in your psyche to get to even deeper stuff than that, you know. Sometimes we feel like we've hit that depth, but you can go so deeply. You know, now I'm going off the rails here, but I do feel that for me it's the biggest challenge in a way. And I say this to my students, like the other day, my student said, oh, I don't think this is a very good poem. And we're all like, this is the most gorgeous poem you've ever written. What are you talking about? And she said, well, I didn't work hard on it. In other words, it just came. It was a gift. You know how that happens sometimes, where you're so open and so receptive that the poem just comes out of you. And so I had to explain to her, if you're sweating and you're all tense, that the real poem you need to write is not going to happen. So the challenge always, especially in this world we live in, you know, is to, you know, get rid of all that stuff, all of the surfaces and all of the stresses and tensions, and, you know, be brave enough to let go of that stuff. They're trappings and they trap us, you know. You get rid of that stuff and just try to find our own very particular and beautiful human hearts and what those hearts need to say, I think. I can blather on, but I'm going to stop now.
I
Does
mean,
that
I
make
love
sense
it.
to you, though? Thank you.
I
Okay,
want
that,
to, yeah, just say that. I mean, it's amazing to think about that and the way that you have multiple voices in a poem. Like for me, there's this like idea of permission to speak in other voices and persona or do things like that's one thing, but to have multiple voices kind of in that, I loved that. And I think that, yeah, there's something additionally magical about that in poems, rather than just considering another, subject or character, but the actual, spoken word or heard the conversation. Um, I think that, at times I write more like plenty of persona poems or poems that take on a persona more clearly, even if it's not necessarily a poem that's announcing that loudly. Um, and before I got to a lot of these poems, like right after I started getting sober, um, I would wake up extra early. I'm always up at like 4:30, but I'd wake up super early and write out of dreams, be writing. And there were a lot of poems in that feel like they're from some other place. They're in that kind of in-between realm. And so they really do go to that place of another perspective. I'm not sure the question that you asked was also like the lover, the person in the other car. I definitely go to that space when I feel like Alessandra said, I'm not kind of bound up, like when I do feel like loose enough or free enough. Um, and it's something that yeah, I find interesting to me. Sometimes those poems are the most mysterious poems and I can love them. Whether or not they make it out into the world is another piece, but it's an interesting question. Thank you.
Thank you so much for being here with us and sharing this space tonight in celebration of poetry in our new year. I want to thank Alessandra and Matthew again for reading and answering our questions. And I'll be downloading this recording from the cloud and sharing it on social media so that we can share it with people who weren't able to be here tonight, or if you want to watch it again because it was such a good reading. Sophia, did you have a question?
And there's something I wanted to tell Alessandra and Matthew. I'm a traditional Chinese medicine therapist, and in Chinese tradition, poets are said to be messengers of heaven above because they're able to bring that information from other realms and put it into writing on this earth, on this plane. So that's very on point to how you have expressed how you experience your art coming out at moments.
That's lovely. Thank you. I guess we'll end with that then. So everyone, I want to wish you a really good night. Again, please, if you have the means, support our poets by purchasing their books for either yourself or ordering a copy for your local library. And thank you again. Take care, everybody. Be well.